Hi there, everyone. Thank you for listening. We are here at the International Schools Festival put on by the South China Morning Post. I am sat here with John Jalsevac, who is the school director at American School Hong Kong. So, John, the first question I have for you is just what was your schooling experience like growing up?
Well, thank you, Clark. It's good to be here, and it's good to have this chance to speak to you and your listeners. I went to school in Toronto, in Canada, for much of my schooling experience. I did some university training later in the United States, in New York specifically. But as a child in Toronto, I remember much of my schooling at elementary school and secondary as being quite enjoyable. I think that the teachers that I had were engaging, were good people, had their heart in the right place. I don't think that the program necessarily was as rich or as stimulating necessarily as what I think good private or international schools are delivering this day and age. But I felt that I was engaged and supported and encouraged to develop in a holistic sense. Having said that, if I think of holistic approaches to teaching and learning now, I think that you need the horses, so to speak, to deliver that. And so you need people with expertise in various areas. And, you know, my homeroom teacher, call it, my grade 4 teacher, taught us art, taught us music, taught us phys ed. You know, if we weren't well behaved, then she took it away, you know, as though it's punishment to have phys ed. And nowadays you have, you know, skilled people in those areas. And so I would think that experience for kids is different. I think one other thing, if I may say, and if I compare now and then, we often use buzzwords in education, and they do have meaning, but I think to some people perhaps they're overused. And one of them is this notion of student-centered versus teacher-centered. And truly, there is some truth to the fact that in an environment back in 60s and 70s when I was in school, it was very much teacher-centered. The teacher spoke, we listened, we were generally sitting in straight rows. You know, we didn't respond that much. There was no notion of inquiry or guided discovery or play-based learning or learning centers or lots of manipulatives and equipment. It was pretty standard. And now, you know, if that was teacher-led, student-centered means many things different to us nowadays.
Yeah, well, to that point then, how does, American School Hong Kong, how does that differ from the entire experience that you just described?
Yeah, good segue there, thank you. Well, we look for people who come to our school to work in the first place, who have demonstrated competency and skill and expertise in the full suite of learning. So if in a school that concentrates on rote learning and on acquisition of knowledge and lots of memory and preparation for exams and endless amounts of homework is your cup of tea, then find that school, but that's not what exists at American School Hong Kong. Instead, what we want is to engage students in different levels of critical thinking. So if knowledge is call it the foundation piece or the basic piece, and there's nothing wrong with knowledge. We want kids to be informed and to have lots of knowledge. But we want them to be able to apply that and to analyze that and to synthesize that and to use it in context and to then create something new with that. And if you don't give them opportunities to engage in those types of learning experiences, then it's a disservice to them and you're cheating them. So at our school, we are aware of the different critical thinking skills levels, and what we're trying to do is when we think of our commands that we as teachers use dozens of times a day, it's not only plan, list, state, name, it's instead justify, balance, support your argument, create. So you're giving them different action verbs that you force them to develop, a stronger capacity to learn. You're forcing them to internalize it more. You're forcing them to take responsibility for their education because you're calling on them to put more into it. And I think that is a fundamental difference in what existed when I was a student, and certainly what we take great pride in at American School Hong Kong to ensure that students are part of.
Oh, that's great. So a lot of what you just said would fall into the category of the question I'm about to ask, but if you were to describe the culture of the school, what would your answer be?
I would begin that with maybe some of this, I don't know if I call it soft skills, but the interpersonal, dimension of a school. I believe very, very strongly that we in education aspire people to think of school as community. And an extension of a family. The reality is that children nowadays, I guess for many generations actually, spend more of their waking hours with their teachers than they do with their parents, for 15 years. And so we have to take responsibility not only for developing their intellectual capacity and abilities, but we have to look at their interpersonal, so the social, the physical, the creative relationship dimensions. And so you want to foster a community where there is a strong sense of respect that permeates everything that you do, where the smile index is high, where it's a very warm atmosphere, very welcoming and invitational place to be, where children go home at the end of the day excited in the car drive home, to talk about their experience at school or at the dinner table that night. And if we don't bring that to the fore, then I think that we are not fulfilling our mission. I believe that the American School Hong Kong and our parent surveys, satisfaction surveys would support that we have a very strong sense of community. It's in part fostered by the fact that we're not a school with 2,000 students. We have small classes where, we have 300 students. We started with 80, we went to 140, we went to 200, we went to 240, we're now at 300, so we're growing nicely. At some point, we'll reach our capacity of 900 students in a fully renovated, wonderful building and facility. But it's a place where someone feels valued and respected and supported, and that's the strong aspect for me when I think about the philosophy or culture of the school.
Fantastic. Switching gears here a little bit, we're at the International Schools Festival. There's been a lot of parents that have come in and out today asking many questions, I imagine, to you. Curious, have any questions stuck out to you? What types of questions are parents asking? And then to follow up on that, what type of questions do you think parents should be asking at an event like this?
I have two kind of anecdotes to answer your question with that come to mind, and that is that, first of all, I've been in Hong Kong for 17 years. And I have been to many of these fairs, and the number one question we get asked by a wide margin is, where do your kids go to university? And I'm always expecting a question of that nature, and I always find it a bit strange because often the child that's standing next to the parent who is asking the question is 2 years old. And they want to know where your kids are going to university. So the answer to that will tell them everything they need to know about our school and the performance results and the success and the culture and everything about this. Now, I don't mean to diminish the importance of having high expectations and standards and to be ambitious for your children and to want the best for their children. Of course, that's very, very important. But what I wish they would hope for. What I hope for instead is what I wish they would ask is something like, when a child graduates from your school, how do you measure success? How do you feel that you have accomplished what the school's goals are? What would I see in that child which would give me confidence in your school community? If you could tell me what what are the outcomes of them going to that school? To me, I could answer that, and I could speak about that for many, many hours, and that to me is a more important question.
Sure. I'm curious as well, just with the hindsight of the past year of dealing with COVID, going online, coming back, curious if you could describe any of the practical, meaningful lessons learned from that you've been able to grab onto moving forward in continuing the educational process. Would there be anything you could describe in that light?
Well, a couple of things. From a management point of view and an administrative point of view, I have been confronted with and reminded of the need to never be certain and never think that you can predict where this pandemic will take us. I write a weekly newsletter, and in that newsletter, I often give some account of where we're at vis-a-vis, COVID and social distancing and absence of extracurricular activities, and whether we were in a face-to-face program or not. And occasionally I look back at those over the last 2 years, and I see in them sometimes predictions that I think our basketball, season 2 will run as scheduled. Well, we haven't had basketball in 2 years. I think our concert band will be ready to perform in time for the spring concert. We haven't played a brass or woodwind instrument in 2 years. So I've learned to be cautious with regard to predictions. The other thing I've learned is that we in our school and in every good school, I think we did everything we possibly could to ensure that we were maintaining a strong program while engaged in e-learning. That we were, not just reviewing work and delivering worksheets and so on, but that we were, advancing the learning program, that we were following our standards and our curriculum, that we were delivering what parents pay good money for and expect. But I think what we've learned is that a full day of watching your teacher and your classmates on Zoom eventually has limitations, and the momentum cannot be sustained. And they need to be back in school, and they need to relate to one another on a face-to-face basis, a more personal basis, and to use all of the equipment and resources that you have in the school. And so we have learned how to take advantage of technology and how to deliver a program and to flip classrooms and to engage kids in assuming more ownership and responsibility for their education. And I think great lessons have come out of that. But we've also learned the huge value of being present in the school and in the classrooms.
Sure, definitely. I just have one more question for you. Just imagining any of the parents walking around here, if they were to ask you, maybe they have, what do you look for in the teachers that you are hiring?
Yeah, thank you. I've hired literally hundreds of teachers over the years. For many, many years, we would go to teacher recruitment fairs, and we would have, at some of the big fairs, we'd have 700 teachers that would come to that fair. There might be 100 schools there. 3/4 of the people would leave with a job. And in advance of the fair, you would have a full file available to them with 4 or 5 confidential reference checks available on the file that the teacher's previous employers would fill out. And you'd have lots of information on how they affect morale in the school, how they prepare, what the relationship is like with parents and administrators, what extracurricular activities they get involved in, how effective they are in the classroom. So we have a lot of information to help us, and we look for that. But over and above that, what I'm looking for is a person who who I said earlier, that they spend a lot of time with, the children spend a lot of time with their parents, with their teachers more than they would with their parents and through their waking hours. We have a saying in Latin that they act in loco parentis, as a good person would in the absence of the parent. And apologies if I've already said that earlier today, but it really speaks to the fact that I want people who have their heart in the right place, who demonstrate throughout their career that they have been very caring, very kind-hearted, very loving and supportive of children. And if you can find someone like that, who and couple that with a person who works hard and is well prepared and knowledgeable and so on, then you have a wonderful teacher, to be proud of, that's part of your school community. So I'm really looking for those personal attributes and qualities and characteristics.
Great. John Jalsevac, School Director, American School Hong Kong. Thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate you answering these questions.
Thank you, Clark. It's been a pleasure. I appreciate it. Thanks for the opportunity. All the best to you. All
Thank
right.
you.
Thank you.